On the 16th of May 1940, one French tank came down a road below the village of Stonne and drove into the flank of a German column. It was a Char B-1 bis. Its commander was a captain named Pierre Billotte. In a few minutes, it destroyed 13 German tanks and 2 anti-tank guns. Afterwards, the tank was examined. The reported count was 140 strike marks on the armor, and not one of them had gone through. That was not a freak result. It was the normal result when a German tank gun of 1940 met the front plate of a French heavy tank. The Char B-1 bis carried 2.4 inches of armor across the whole front. The standard German anti-tank weapon that spring was a 37mm gun. German crews named that gun during this campaign. They called it the Army Doorknocker, because against a Char B-1 bis or a British Matilda, it announced itself and did nothing else. The name stuck, and a year later in Russia, it was still accurate. France had the heavier tank. Its armor was thicker. In the Somua S35, France fielded a medium tank with a better gun and better protection than anything inside a German panzer division, and France had more tanks with its field armies than Germany did. The German attack opened on the 10th of May. On the afternoon of the 13th, 3 panzer divisions forced the Meuse at Sedan. The breach they opened in the French front was never closed, and 8 days after that, the leading German units reached the sea. The ground the Germans used to get there was ground the French army had studied and rated as bad tank country. The Ardennes is roughly 80 miles of wooded hill country, cut by narrow valleys, with a road network of a few winding routes and a great many bridges. French staff work through the 1930s did not say the Ardennes was impassable. It said something more useful to the Germans than that. It said a large armored force moving through it would be slow, would be strung out on a handful of roads, and could be caught and delayed while the French moved reserves to the Meuse. French assessments put the crossing of the Ardennes alone at between 5 and 9 days, and concluded that a German force would not reach the river for about 2 weeks. Pre-war staff exercises allowed 60 hours for an armored force to get through the forest under perfect conditions, and then added the days it would take for that force to turn back into an army on the far side. That estimate was not stupid. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was correct for an army that moved the way the French army moved. Panzer Group Kleist put more than 41,000 vehicles onto 4 march routes through that country. Heinz Guderian's 19th Army Corps crossed into Luxembourg at 5:30 in the morning on the 10th of May and was over the Belgian frontier by 10. His corps was the 1st, 2nd and 10th Panzer Divisions, with motorized infantry, engineers and the Großdeutschland Infantry Regiment attacked. What waited at Sedan was the French Second Army under General Charles Hunziger, and inside it, the 10th Corps. The sector was held by the 55th and 71st Infantry Divisions. Both were second-line formations, rated Category B, filled out with older reservists, short of anti-aircraft guns and short of anti-tank guns. They had been digging concrete for months, and much of it was unfinished. The 71st was not even settled in the line. It had been ordered forward out of reserve and was still moving into position when the attack arrived, taking over part of the 55th Division's frontage east of Sedan on the morning of the 13th of May. The relief was still completing on the day of the assault. The numbers at Sedan in the second week of May ran roughly like this. About 60,000 German troops in the assaulting corps, with 771 tanks. Against them, about 20,000 French troops in the two divisions on the river. One figure in that comparison goes the other way. The Germans brought about 141 artillery pieces to the Sedan crossing. The French in the sector had about 174. The side that forced the river had less artillery than the side defending it. The reason the best French formations were not there is that they were somewhere else on purpose. The French plan sent the strongest armies north into Belgium to meet the German advance through the Low Countries, and the mechanized divisions went with. Sedan was a hinge. Hinges were held with second-line troops. The equipment on both sides then was nothing softened. The Char B1 bis was a heavy tank of about 32 tons. 2.4 inches of armor on the hull front. A 75mm howitzer mounted in the hull, aimed by turning the whole tank on a precision steering gear, and a 47mm gun in the turret. Around 369 of them were delivered between 1937 and the summer of 1940. Nothing in a panzer division could reliably penetrate one from the front. It had two problems, and neither was the armor. The first was the turret. One man sat in it. He aimed the 47mm gun, then loaded it, then fired it. He worked the machine gun. And he commanded the tank, and often the platoon as well, while doing all of it. Every one of those jobs competes with the others. A German Panzer III carried a commander who only commanded, a gunner who only aimed, and a loader who only loaded. The second was fuel, and the published figures for it disagree. The specification quoted most often gives about 105 gallons and a road range near 110 miles, which works out at roughly 6 hours of running. Other accounts give barely half of that. Take the generous version, and the conclusion does not move. A crew got most of one day's driving out of a full tank, and then the tank had to be found by a fuel column on a road at a place somebody had predicted the day before. In 1940, the French supply system and the French command system were both moving at the speed of the 1918 army that produced. The Somua S35 was the other machine that outclassed the Germans. A cast hull, a 47mm gun, about 1.8 inches of armor on the hull, and about 1.6 on the turret. It weighed 20 tons, and it could keep up with a cavalry advance. It also had the one-man turret, and it had one more problem that mattered more than any of that. 4 out of every 5 Somua S35s had no radio. The sets that existed were issued to platoon command tanks, 1 in 5, and the other 4 crews took their orders from a commander leaning out of a hatch waving flag. Against those 2 machines, the German inventory was thin. At the tank battle of Hanot in Belgium, fought between the 12th and the 14th of May, the German 16th Army Corps put 618 tanks into the fight. 252 of them were panzer ones, which carried 2 machine guns and about half an inch of armor. Another 234 were Panzer IIs with a 20mm gun. 82 were Panzer IIIs with the 37mm. 50 were Panzer IVs with a short 75mm gun built to throw high explosive at bunkers, not armor-piercing shot at tanks. 4 out of 5 German tanks in that battle could not damage a Somua from the front at any range at all. Totals for the whole campaign depend entirely on what you count, so here is the basis. Counting tanks with the field armies in the northeast and leaving out depot stock, training units and the colonies, the French had about 3,254 tanks and the Germans about 2,439. Other tallies pushed the German figure toward 3,000 by adding vehicles that arrived later, or by counting command tanks with no main gun. Whichever basis you use, the French had more, and the best of them were better. Stonne settles whether French armor could fight. What happened between the 10th and the 15th of May made the answer irrelevant. The traffic came first. 41,000 vehicles on 4 roads is not a march, it is a queue. The columns backed up behind every bridge and every junction, and the vehicles of Panzer Group Kleist strung out over something like 155 miles of road. A staff officer of the 1st Panzer Division wrote about looking at the clear blue sky and thinking what a target the division made while it could only crawl forward along a single road. That queue was the campaign's single biggest vulnerability. The Germans solved it with paperwork. March tables, timed serials, movement priorities settled in advance, military police standing at road junctions with the authority to stop a general's car, fuel dumped forward so vehicles refueled from the roadside without leaving the column. It is the least cinematic work in the whole operation, and it is the reason the Corps arrived at the river on the 12th of May instead of the 20th. French reconnaissance aircraft flew over that queue and photographed. The reports went back and were discounted at higher headquarters, where attention was fixed on the German advance into Belgium. The lead elements of 1st Panzer Division reached the Meuse opposite Sedan on the afternoon of the 12th of May, 2 days into the campaign, against an assessment that had allowed 2 weeks. They arrived without their artillery. Most of the Corps guns were still somewhere in the Ardennes queue, and the batteries that were up had limited ammunition. A river crossing without artillery is not normally attempted, because the whole point of the guns is to keep the defenders' heads down and his own artillery silent during the minutes when the assault troops are in boat. Guderian's solution was worked out with Bruno Loerza, who commanded the 2nd Air Corps. The Luftwaffe's own plan, drawn up by Hugo Sperler, was the conventional one, a concentrated bombardment of about 20 minutes, and then the ground attack. Guderian and Loerza threw that out and ran the opposite scheme. Small formations, arriving continuously, all day, so that the French gunners on the far bank never got a gap long enough to serve their pieces. On the 13th of May, the German air units flew somewhere near 3,940 sorties over the Sedan sector. The 2nd Air Corps flew about 1,770 missions, and the 8th about 910. One dive bomber wing alone flew 201 sorties. 6 German aircraft were lost. The dive bombers were not more effective than artillery. They were less accurate, and they carried less weight of explosive per hour. What they were was present. Artillery stuck on a forest road is worth nothing at all. The assault went in during the afternoon. 1st Panzer Division crossed at Guderian, just north of Sedan. Took the Großdeutschland Regiment and assault engineers over with it, and pushed for the heights of La Marfée behind the town. 2nd Panzer went in on the right near Donchery. 10th Panzer crossed to the south at Wadelincourt, where French fire destroyed 81 of the 96 rubber boats before the crossing even started, and the survivors went over anyway. There was one more substitution for the missing guns. German anti-aircraft batteries were run down to the riverbank and laid on the concrete opposite. An 88mm gun has a very flat trajectory, which means a gunner can put a round through a bunker embrasure from across the water instead of dropping shells somewhere near it. One account of the operation puts 16 of them on the Sedan crossing. They were doing the work of siege artillery, because siege artillery was 40 miles back in a queue. The bunkers on the French bank were reduced one at a time with direct fire and demolition charges. The last of them surrendered at 20 minutes to 11 that night. Then the French line came apart in a way that had nothing to do with tanks. Late on the 13th, a rumor moved through the artillery of the 55th Division that German tanks were already on the ridge at Bulson behind them. It was false. Not one German tank had crossed the river. The bridge had not been built yet. Batteries limbered up and pulled back, staff left their posts, and by nightfall the division that held the center of the sector had largely stopped functioning as a division. That episode is remembered as the Panic of Bulson. Underneath the morale is an information failure. The 55th Division had no way to establish where the German tanks actually were, because its forward telephone lines were cut and its reporting ran up a chain that took hours. German engineers finished a pontoon bridge at Guderian at 1 in the morning on the 14th of May. The first tanks crossed at 20 minutes past 7. The French counterattack was ordered on that same night. General Pierre released his corps reserve, 2 infantry regiments and 2 tank battalions equipped with Renault R35 light tanks. Orders went out at 5 in the morning. The attack moved at 7:30 and reached the Bulson Ridge at 8:45. Both sides made their decision during the same night. One side had armor on the far bank by 7:20. The other side had orders in hand at 5 and troops moving at 5:30. The French tanks arrived at the ridge to find German tanks already on it and anti-tank guns already sighted. By the end of the 13th, the bridgehead was about 3 miles wide and 4 to 6 miles deep. By the 15th, it had swallowed the counterattack and was growing westward. The Allied air forces went after the bridges on the 14th. 109 British bombers were sent against them and 47 were lost. The bridges held. Allied aircraft losses that day ran to 167. Meanwhile, the French heavy armor was doing exactly what it was designed to do, in the wrong place. At Stonne, on the southern shoulder, French infantry and Char B-1 bis tanks fought the 10th Panzer Division and the Grossdeutschland Regiment for 3 days from the 15th of May. The village changed hands 17 times. Billotte's tank made its run on the 16th, and some accounts break his 13 down as 11 Panzer IIIs and 2 Panzer IVs, and through all of it the shoulder held. Holding the shoulder was not the problem. The breach was 100 yards to the west of it and moving. The same pattern had already run in Belgium. At Hannut and then at Gembloux, General René Priault's cavalry corps, built around the 2nd and 3rd Light Mechanized Divisions, fought the German 16th Corps with about 520 tanks, including 176 Somua S35s. It was a competent fight. The French lost about 121 tanks destroyed, damaged or abandoned. The Germans had 52 destroyed and 111 damaged, and by the 16th of May, roughly a third of the German armor in that corps was not running. French armor had met German armor on something like equal terms and come out level. It was 100 miles from where the campaign was being decided. What settled Sedan comes down to a handful of unglamorous factors. The first of them is a radio. The standard German tank radio in 1940 was a single set that both transmitted and received, and it was normal equipment in an ordinary line tank rather than a privilege of command tanks. Section and company commander vehicles carried an extra receiver on top of it, so they could listen on 2 nets at once. That means a German company commander could redirect his tanks while they were moving, in seconds, without stopping and without anyone opening a hatch. On the French side, radios were command equipment rather than crew equipment. 4 in 5 Somua S35s had none. The men who did have sets were in the same one-man turrets that already required them to aim, load, and fire. A French tank commander who wanted to change his platoon's direction had to be seen, which meant stopping, which meant standing up. Scale that difference up. It stops being a communications detail and becomes the shape of the battle. A German panzer division could receive a change of plan and act on it inside an hour. The French system was built the other way on purpose. Its doctrine, the methodical battle, worked by preparing an operation in detail, then issuing written orders down a chain of headquarters, then executing it on a timetable. Its command cycle was measured in days, sometimes in half days at best. That was a design, not an oversight. It came out of 1916 and 1918, where the methodical battle produced results and improvisation produced casualties. It fit an army whose reserves moved by rail and whose infantry walked. The second factor is where the tanks were. Of roughly 3,000 French tanks in the field, only about 960 sat in the armored and light mechanized division. The rest were distributed to infantry formations in tank battalions whose job was to advance at the speed of a walking soldier and reduce machine gun positions. A German panzer division averaged around 270 tanks. A French armored or light mechanized division averaged about 160, and about half of those were light infantry tanks. French superiority in numbers and quality was real, and it was also spread across a front in packets that could not concentrate, could not talk to each other, and could not be redirected fast enough to matter. The third factor is a single decision, and it is the one that turned a successful river crossing into a broken front. On the 12th of May, Guderian had already indicated he wanted to push the bridgehead out to about 12 miles. Ewald von Kleist, his superior, ordered him to stop at about 5 miles and consolidate. Gerd von Rundstedt confirmed that order at 11:45 on the 14th. The correct textbook move after a contested crossing is to hold, bring the artillery over, thicken the flanks, and wait for the infantry corps to catch up. Guderian refused it. He wrote afterwards that he neither would nor could accept orders that gave away the surprise and the success he had already gained, and that the conversation became extremely heated. What he extracted from Kleist was permission to conduct a reconnaissance in force. He then used that phrase to move his entire corps west. On the 17th, the argument came again, and he offered his resignation over it, and again he was left free to keep moving. The reason that mattered is what it did to French time. A consolidated bridgehead is a target with a fixed address. A corps driving west at speed presents a new problem to French headquarters every few hours, and every one of those problems has to go up the chain, get an order written, and come back down. The German advance was moving faster than the French command cycle could produce answers. There is a clean test of that, and it is the counterattack at Montcornet on the 17th of May. Colonel Charles de Gaulle's 4th Armoured Division attacked the German flank with more than 200 tanks. It worked. The Germans were driven out of the village. Then the division had to withdraw because it had no infantry with it, no anti-aircraft cover, and German aircraft found it. That division was ordered into being on the 11th of May, the day after the invasion opened, and it was assembled on the battlefield itself. Its component units arrived in packets on the 15th, the 17th, the 20th, the 23rd, and later still. On the day it attacked, it had most of its tanks and very little of anything else. The flank was genuinely open. The armor to hit it genuinely existed. What did not exist was a system that could deliver that armor with fuel, infantry, and air cover attached, at the place where it would have mattered, on the day it would have mattered. On the 20th of May, German units reached the sea near Abbeville. The armies in the north were cut off from the armies in the south, and the front that had been broken at Sedan on the 13th was still broken. Go back to Billotte's tank on the road below Stonne. 140 hits, no penetration, 13 German tanks destroyed in a few minutes. Nothing about that afternoon was a fluke, and nothing about it was reversed later. It was a true reading of the machine. By the middle of June, a large share of the surviving French heavy tanks had been abandoned. Most were not destroyed. They were out of fuel. Others were out of contact or ordered somewhere they could not reach in the time they had been given. Germany took roughly 160 Char B1 bis into its own service afterward. Some were stripped for driver training, and some were converted into flamethrower tanks. They went on working for years under a different flag. The armor was never the variable. Everything wrapped around it was. whether the tank could be told something while it was moving, whether the fuel arrived on the same road on the same day, whether the headquarters above it could make a decision in hours rather than in days, and whether it was permitted to make that decision at all. A tank is not a weapon on its own. It is the delivery end of a system. Behind it stand a radio net, a fuel column, a repair section, and a chain of command, and the tank is only ever as fast as the slowest of those. In May 1940, France put the better machine on the field, and Germany put the better system around it. That is the entire result at Sedan, and it fits in one sentence. The plate held. The headquarters did not.